I left Chile in 2012, and I've never longed so badly, so deadly to be there.
October 6th, 2019. The public transit fares in Santiago, Chile increased by 30 pesos, or about 4 or 5 cents. Immediately, students take to the streets and start jumping turnstiles in protest. Eventually, the protests grow big enough that police have to crack down. And then, it explodes. By the end of the month, upwards of 2 million people are protesting across the country, some of them peaceful, others setting fires. In Santiago alone, there are almost 1.5 million packing the streets. They're protesting everything from access to healthcare and education to the private pension system and inequalities in general.
And the demands exceed everything the government was able to offer.
President Sebastián Piñera declares a state of emergency. Police are unloading fire hoses and tear gas and rubber bullets into the crowds. People are going blind. The government says it'll roll back the subway fare price hike. It's not enough.
But it was already too late.
36 people die, almost 12,000 are wounded, almost 30,000 arrested. So eventually, Piñera offers up something huge. The Chilean Constitution.
I would say the main problem with 1980s Constitution is that it was created in a dictatorship. If we have had the same Constitution written in a democratic period, the Constitution would never be an issue.
Right. Let's pause there because this story actually starts almost 50 years ago. 1973. In a military coup backed by the United States, far-right Commander-in-Chief Augusto Pinochet overthrew the socialist presidency of Salvador Allende. Pinochet declared himself president but was, in reality, a dictator for the next 17 years. In 1980, there was a constitutional referendum that ensured Pinochet would remain in power until 1988 and increased the power of the president. In 1988, with another referendum, Pinochet was narrowly voted out, and Chile had democratic elections for the first time in almost 20 years.
So I was born in 1987, 1 year before the referendum that finally sealed the fate of Pinochet's regime. And by the late 90s, I more or less have an idea of what was going on. And thinking about the impact of the 1980 Constitution in my life, perhaps the most noticeable thing for me was the existence of certain senators that were not voted by population, but rather they were finger-appointed by the military force. The goal of having those senators was making sure that they could make a tiebreak in case of there happened to be any imbalance of powers. But we also have senators for life. So the Constitution said that every president, once he or she finished their period, they would become senators for life.
After his presidency, Pinochet was the commander-in-chief of the army until 1998 when he retired and became a senator for life. He resigned in 2002 in the middle of legal battles involving human rights violations.
Although I grew up in a privileged space, so there are many things I didn't see, but I remember that vividly when I was developing some conscience and realizing that there were people making decisions who were finger-appointed or they were just there because they were former presidents. That was very telling.
Over the next 30 years, Pinochet's constitution remained in place, but in the background. Since 1990, Chile has had peaceful democratic elections and transitions of power. And in 2005, the president changed the constitution to remove the policy of non-elected senators. So come 2019, the people didn't take to the streets with the clear end goal of scrapping their 40-year-old constitution.
It was present in the protest, but it was not the main thing of the protest. On the sides, of course, it was this idea of let's change Pinochet's constitution, but it was never the main claim. The main problem for many people was not the constitution itself, but rather the legacy, the legal legacy of the dictatorship that goes beyond the constitution itself.
This legacy includes things like the education, healthcare, and pension systems.
Pensions in Chile are miserable. An average pension today could be less than half of the minimum wage.
Under Pinochet's regime, these things basically became businesses, even though in writing they were still nonprofit.
Over the last 2-3 years, what we observed was an accumulation of injustices that were legally supported.
And since 1990, there have been some smaller, more specific protests against these legacies.
But the big change of 2019 was that it was a protest against the whole system. Was the claim of changing the constitution there at previous times? Yes, it was. but it was never a powerful claim. And honestly, I don't think it was a powerful claim in 2019 either. It was there, but just as one other. So it was, and that's important to highlight. 2019 protests did not aim to change the Constitution. They aimed to change the whole system.
Students have protested many times in the past over price hikes in the subway fares, but this time it was, for whatever reason, enough of a trigger to start something bigger.
It started as a small thing located in Santiago, the capital, but then it connected, emotionally connected, with what was happening nationwide, what it was called the mother of all marches.
It's also known as the Chilean Spring. Chile's population is about 18 million, so at the height of last year's protests, more than 10% of the country was out in the streets.
I made a Facebook post that day saying like how much I would love to be there only for one day, at least for that single day. That was the most massive day of protest in the history of Chile.
During the protests, President Piñera offered up some changes, like higher taxes on the wealthy, but it wasn't enough.
I would say historically, at least in the last few decades, the main problem of the right wing was how to handle massive protests. In 2012, when people were protesting, we want free college. Piñera, who was also president at the time, he said, education is a commodity, like everything else. And of course, that, I would say in Spanish, apagar el fuego con benzina. And something similar happened here. People were already demanding a handful of other things that they were not addressing.
So finally, President Piñera offers a referendum or plebiscite to decide on the Constitution.
Una nueva constitución.
Offering up the Constitution is a big thing. It was just beyond their control at that point. That was the only thing that would satisfy the people.
It's an interesting question. I think it was a radical decision, but at the same time was the easiest decision. Because if Piñera's government had assumed the full responsibility of fulfilling the demands, he would have to give up everything he believes. And I think instead of doing that, they took a side path that could be the seed to change all the rest. Basically, do not go room by room. Let's destroy the house and make a new foundation.
The referendum is scheduled for April 2020, and it's only going to have two questions. First, do you want a new constitution? And second, should the people who write it be a convención mixta, a mixture of sitting legislators and elected citizens, or a convención constituyente, a completely brand new body specifically elected to write a new constitution?
When they did announce the vote, how did you react?
It was unexpected. It was very unexpected for me and for everyone. I got no clue how it was going to end it, but I definitely didn't anticipate a referendum.
After the height of the protests, the whole story falls out of the news cycle here in the US. But
the protests went on till March, till COVID forced protests to stop.
Right, the pandemic. The vote is pushed forward 6 months to October 25th.
And actually, it's funny because while in the US, it's establishment media and Trump were blaming the left for the virus.
And this is their new hoax.
In Chile, people would blame the right and the government for the virus.
The protests started back up a few weeks before the referendum last month. And on the 25th, anyone who was COVID-19 positive was not allowed to vote.
I think was necessary. I don't even see it as a necessary evil. It is true that preventing someone from voting is always a bad thing, but allowing people with COVID to vote would also mean to put the whole process in danger. And the least you want to, especially for a process so important like this, is to jeopardize at any point the process. Now, how many people did that affect?
A little under 10,000, and that doesn't take into account children or anyone else who can't vote. So on October 25th, 7 million Chileans go to the polls, over half the eligible voting population. And this is what the capital city of Santiago looks like that night.
I was super happy. I was super happy. The great thing about the Chilean democratic system is that you can know results rapidly. And then when you realize that Apruebo was winning by far, and so was the Convención Constituyente, I was like super happy. That was definitely a celebration day.
The option to approve a brand new constitution, or Apruebo, won by a landslide 79%. And so did the option for a newly elected constitutional convention.
And I was impressed. I think that everyone knew that the Approve was going to win. What no one expected was, first of all, for how much they won. And the second option that was also very important, I think there was more, I thought it was going to be more tight. But in the end, actually, the Convención Constituyente, which was the most democratic of all options, got even more votes than the Apruebo.
But it's not over. There will be 2 more votes over the next 2 years. First, to decide who will make up the Constitutional Convention, and then to decide whether or not they are happy with the new Constitution.
So, if they write something that the majority of the people don't like, that Constitution won't pass, and we will keep the 1980s Constitution.
Oh. Is there there's no second chance to write it again?
I don't think so.
Okay.
So this is going to be it. In Chile, we have had, let's say, 3 long-lasting constitutions: 1833, 1925, and 1980. None of them were created in a fully democratic context. They will be the first constitution, if it works, in the history of Chile to be fully written in a democratic context and to be written by not by a handful of rich men. It's a huge thing. That had rarely happened in world history.
He said a year ago, the story ended with Pinochet getting voted out in 1990. But now, looking ahead, the future's uncertain.
There are many things that can go wrong, and the main threat right now is how political parties are trying to control the writing of the new constitution. Although 80% of the people said we don't want congresspeople or political parties behind the constitution.
In 2022, the Constitution will need a 2/3 majority in order to be approved. But even now, many people are still protesting over their worries that the government will get too involved in controlling the course of the process. So the next 2 votes act as firewalls, which is really important.
To prevent somehow that this could be like twisted in any way.
Right, because that's what I was going to ask. This is going to be a couple of years then. This process, what could happen between now and then?
Just a process of negotiation and a lot of politics. The big debate right now, and it's going to change like day by day, but the big debate right now is who can run to be a constituyente, who can run to be in this group who are going to write the constitution. Because the problem is that the rules to become one of these people were written by the political parties, who of course tried to secure their presence there.
When we look at the situation from a year ago compared to today, emotions around the country have changed. Chileans were fed up and angry during the protests last fall. Now they're cautiously optimistic about how this is going to change their lives.
How do you feel?
I feel both, actually. Like, I feel very hopeful on one hand. I feel like very happy about this path, but at the same time, I'm always like fearing that any given day, political parties will announce, "All right, we did this," and they are like grabbing and keeping the process to themselves.
Watching this play out from the outside, I can't help feeling amazed at what the Chilean people have accomplished, especially in the middle of a global pandemic.
For many people, I would say, especially my students, I think especially for people here in the US, politics is reduced to voting every other year. And politics goes way beyond that. We live politics in our daily life, the way we relate with others, the way we express. Everything is always loaded with politics. You can find there are thousands and millions of people who agree with you and who are willing to express that out loud. And eventually, you can actually achieve something. The problem about limiting politics to only elections is that your chances are always highly limited. Today, people have 2 options. you vote for Trump, you vote for Biden. The good thing about public demonstrations is that you can actually find alternative ways of expressing what do you believe to be right. Sometimes that may provoke something. Sometimes it won't work. In the US, we have, after the killing of George Floyd, we have waves of protest nationwide.
Seattle,
Philadelphia,
Los Angeles,
Miami,
Asheville,
Salt Lake City,
Chicago,
Tallahassee, Florida.
Which achieved nothing. Nothing changed. That's going to happen. But there will be sometimes a time where a big protest national movement can actually achieve something. That's why it is so important. Because that, for me, that's where big changes in society come from. Not from political parties. They come from publicly voicing your concerns. And a protest, a big movement like what happened in Chile, for me, is a great example of that.